Alright class, so this is going on to 5.2. I started on with the note taking with vocabulary. This is over congruent polygons. So we kind of talked about congruent angles. Now we're going to talk about congruent polygons. So this is where you have the more than one sides deal. So now let's talk about corresponding parts. So remember corresponding angles we kind of talked about. So we had two parallel lines and the transversal going through it. So the corresponding part to, or corresponding angle to this side would be here. So think about it as we're in the same offices, but in the same position in the office, but in different buildings. Okay, so for corresponding parts, this is where you have corresponding angles and sides are congruent. So the corresponding angles and sides are congruent. This is where you have a shape and it could be dealing with more than one, and you're going to have the same size or the same shape between these two triangles or other polygons. Okay? So now we have properties of triangle congruence. And so we kind of talked about reflexive, symmetric, and transitive in our last unit dealing with integers. So reflexive, remember we dealt with one element. So 1 will always equal to 1, 2 would always equal to 2, and so for this time I have a triangle and it will always be congruent to itself. Symmetric is where I have two elements. Okay? So where I have two elements, that means if I have this triangle is congruent to that one, then this triangle is also congruent to the other. And then for transitive, this is where I have three elements. So I have one triangle congruent to the other, but this same triangle is congruent to a different one. That means our first and our third are definitely congruent to each other as well. So let's do a visual example of this. So let's say I had two triangles to start off. So I call this one A, B, C, and this one's D, E, and F. Okay? So let's say I had these angles. So when we talked about hash marks and things like that, it tells us which sides are congruent or which angles are congruent. Okay? So now, which ones have the same hash mark? That would be A and D. So angle A is congruent to angle D. So angle B must be congruent to angle E. And angle C must be congruent to angle F. So that's how you use corresponding angles. So now let's talk about corresponding sides. So let's talk about AB must be congruent to line segment DE. So make sure I'm saying line segment. And to do that, I have the line segment on top. AB congruent to line segment DE. Then I have line segment BC is congruent to line segment EF. There might be times this might not look so pretty. It might be rotated. So make sure you realize which line segments are truly congruent to each other. And our last one is AC is congruent to DF. Okay? So this is where if we're using symmetric. So reflexive is where I only have the one. So these congruent will always stay congruent to each other. And if we have symmetric, this is where the corresponding angles come in. Now let's talk about transitive. Transitive is where I have a third triangle. So I have a third triangle here. Make sure I label my sides correctly. This is for this part. This is for sides. So then we're going to label this one as J, K, and L. So that means that even though these are congruent, they're also congruent to J. So if A is congruent to D, D is also congruent to J. So angle D is also congruent to angle J. But that means angle A is also congruent to angle J. So that's what transitive property means. Okay? So then we're going to move on to the bottom. I have the third angle theorem. This is where if I'm given two angles that are congruent to each other, so angle A is congruent to angle D, and angle B is congruent to angle E, like here, that means C must be congruent to angle F. Okay? So I have two angles of one triangle, and then the two angles of the other triangle, and the third angles are also congruent. So these two must be congruent. Okay? So that's kind of just a given. If I'm given two angles and their corresponding parts, that means the corresponding third angle has to be congruent too. Okay? So if we flip over to the next page, we have practices, practices, practices. And we're flipping over, we have extra practice 1. So let's practice classifying these and identifying all the corresponding parts and pairs. So let's say we're talking about the angles. What's congruent to angle P? What's congruent to angle P is angle S. Then, what about Q? So which one has the two of them? That'll be angle T. Then I have angle R is congruent to angle U. Okay, so those are the angles. So now let's talk about the sides. So let's talk about PQ. So line segment PQ right here. So I'm going from the two angles to the three angles. So two angles to three angles would be ST. Line segment ST. What about what's congruent to line segment QR? Well, QR goes from 2 to the 1, so here it would be TU. And then we have RP, and that is congruent to US, line segment US. So that's how you classify what's congruent. And once you find both of these that are congruent to each other, then you can conclude that the triangles are congruent to each other as well. Okay, so let's see if we can do this one. So I will do the sides and you'll give me the angles. So side AB is congruent to line segment EF. Then I have line segment BC, so BC here is congruent to FG. Okay? Line segment FG. Line segment CD is congruent to line segment GH. And line segment AD is congruent to EH. So I've given you the sides, now tell me the angles, which angles are congruent to each other. Awesome. So now we're going to go to exercise 3 and 4. Okay? And so this one is asking to find the values of x and y. So we're trying to find what x equals, and we're trying to find what y equals. Okay? So now I have two congruent sides. Okay? So now I have angles, and I have sides given to me. So what can I say about this angle y and angle s? Well, I definitely have angles to angles, right? I didn't want to do angles to sides because that wouldn't make sense. So these are my corresponding angles, and when they're corresponding angles, where I have s is congruent to angle y, all I have to do is set them equal to each other. So I now have 2x minus 20 equals 30. So I add 20 to both sides. So 2x equals 50. And I divide by 2, x equals 25. So x is 25, and we completed that part. Okay? So now I'm going to do the same thing with my sides. So I have side here and side here. So I have line segment XZ is congruent to line segment ST. So when they're congruent to each other, they're equal. So I'm going to set my equations equal to each other. So I have 15 equals 3y plus 9. And I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides. And so I have 6 equals 3y. And when I divide by 3, y equals 2. Okay? So now for number 4, I still have to find x and y. So x is something and y is something. Okay? So this time they gave me 2 angles. So now it's wondering which ones are paired up the same way. So let's find out what angle A is. What could be congruent to angle A? Based on its tilt, it looks like line segment is the top here, and then it slants down. So it looks like angle E will definitely be our best bet because it's in the corner like A is. Okay, so A and E are congruent to each other. And so I'm going to set them equal. So I have 60 plus 8x equals 108. And when I have that, I subtract 60 from both sides. So 8x equals 48. When I divide by 8, x now equals 6. So 8 is 6. So now let's find y. And y is up here with 3x. But I know that c and g must be congruent to each other. So I have 62 equals 3y, or 8y, minus 3x. But I don't know what x is. X is 6, so I'm just going to plug it in. So 62 equals 8y minus 3 times 6. So when I plug it in, I now have 62 equals 8y minus 18. I'm going to add 18 to both sides. So I'm left with 80 plus 8y, or 80 equals 8y. And when I divide by 8, y equals 10. Okay, so those are some two-step problems that you need to identify your corresponding parts, solving for x and y. Okay, so flipping over to the next page, I have show the polygons are congruent. So this is where you're telling me are which sides are congruent to each other and which angles are congruent to each other. Okay, so just make sure you label those. I'm going to have you do these two on your own. So showing that the polygons are congruent, that means give me corresponding parts. And then the explain your reasoning, you're going to tell me if you're going to be using reflexive, symmetric, or transitive properties of triangle congruencies. So you're going to show me any of those reasons to prove that they're true. Okay, number 7 and 8 we will do together. So it says find the measure of angle 1. So I have this itty bitty triangle and I have this itty bitty triangle. So focusing on those triangles, A and D are very congruent to each other. So that means angle A is 33 degrees. But what is angle 1? Say I were to draw this line here. Doesn't that look like a transversal? So if I were to use corresponding angles, what is angle 1? Angle 1 is also 33 degrees because angle C and angle D are corresponding angles. But say I didn't recognize that right away. What about A and half of C? Or angle 1? It should be angle 1. Then I can say using angle A and angle 1 are alternate angles. So you can also use alternate angles to find that this is 33 degrees as well. Okay? There's more than one ways to do this. So let's talk about 8. So I have number 8 here, says find angle 1. So angle 1 is definitely congruent to angle 2. So angle 1 is congruent to angle U. Okay? And so now, we don't have any angles here, but we do have angles here. And this is where we talked about 5.1. We're using the Triangle Sum Theorem. And that's where we add the interior angles to 180. Okay? So I'm going to add these all up to get 180. But note, I have a missing angle here. But I know if I find this angle, it would also be the same as angle 1. So I would do 80 plus my 54 plus the measure of angle U equals 180 degrees. So 80 plus 54 is 134. Plus the measure of angle U equals 180, and I'm going to subtract 134. So the measure of angle U is 46 degrees. So if I know this is 46 degrees, that means angle 1 is also 46 degrees because these are also corresponding angles. Okay? So if you are done with this and solving for what you need to know, on the back is another puzzle, and it's 5.2. It says, what did the grouchy baker make? And so that will be your homework, and we will complete that as soon as possible. No, I know it did shift a little bit, but this is angle T and B, and this is identify the congruent corresponding parts given that these two triangles are congruent, okay? And so I apologize for that, but that is your homework assignment, and that concludes 5.2. Thank you.